Neama, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. And I know that you're there in the Los Angeles area. Your offices are in the downtown area of Los Angeles. Before we get started into the legality of what happened today between the Trump administration and Governor Gavin Newsom, I just want to ask you what you've seen there from your vantage points as this is now entering the fifth day.
Christina, thank you. I'm sitting here in downtown Los Angeles, and the vast majority of the protesters are peaceful, but there's certainly been violent rioters, especially at night. Things do tend to be getting better over time, in large part, I think, due to that National Guard presence. Not just myself, but as far as my experience as well, I used to work for the city of Los Angeles. I used to do enforcement there for years at the top 2 floors of City Hall. So not only do I live and work in Los Angeles, but I'm a native Angelino, and this is certainly hitting our community hard, both in terms of the folks who are affected by this immigration enforcement, but the rest of the law-abiding citizens of Los Angeles that do not want to see these rioters continue.
And so as we've seen this face-off continue, not only against federal police as well in the city with other Angelinos, we're also seeing a face-off in terms of government officials. Of course, President Trump and Governor Gavin Newsom trading shots back and forth over the last few days, but it all comes down to what they think should be happening there in the city. We know that President Trump originally deployed the Guard, he says, to protect federal buildings and personnel. But it was the governor's request that was filed in court that stated that the state's military department was told that the Pentagon plans to direct the California National Guard to start providing support for immigration raids. Before we dive into that ultimate decision, first, let's talk about this move that was done by the governor. Was it expected that he was going to take this legal battle to court?
It was, Christina. He was conducting interviews Sunday evening, and he said he was going to file a lawsuit, and he filed it the very next day. He filed it yesterday, and the case was assigned to Judge Charles Breyer. If that name sounds familiar, that's the younger brother of former Justice Stephen Breyer. So he's a Clinton appointee. I'm sure everyone wants to know who the judge is and how he will rule. In this particular case, we're talking about an important issue, federalism, and who has control when you have the executive of the United States, the president, and the executive of the state of California that are in disagreement. And generally speaking, federal law does control in these circumstances. Obviously, we're talking about some unique circumstances here because the National Guard is typically under the governor's control under Title 32. But there are circumstances where the president can federalize the National Guard, even over the governor's objection under Title 10, which is what we're dealing with here, Christina.
And so the two of them, they have never been the best of friends, but we've seen moments where they've come together, shaking hands, even in this photo right there. But Nina, yes, like you just said, the district judge, Charles Breyer, declined Newsom's request to issue the order immediately and is now giving the Trump administration the time that they requested to file a response. He's set up a hearing right now for Thursday to determine whether or not to issue that temporary restraining order. Ultimately, why did the judge decide to make this decision?
I think that's the right move, Christina. You're talking about federal law that's on its face seems to favor the Trump administration's position here. And I've come on the show and I've been critical of the president, saying he's done things that are unlawful, even things that are unconstitutional. But in this case, if you look at the law, it allows the president to take over the National Guard under one of 3 circumstances. One, if there's a foreign invasion. I know the president said that's happening. I'm not sure that's the case. The second is if there's a rebellion against U.S. authority. So maybe that's something you're dealing with here. And the third is probably most likely to apply that if the president believes that he's unable to enforce federal law with the agents and officers that he has. And that appears to be the case. And the reason that's important, Christina, is under California law, the Values Act, state and local police officers and sheriff's deputies, they are prohibited from actually helping with civil immigration enforcement. So now, regardless of how you feel about it politically, and I understand that immigration is a hot button political issue, I don't think the president has the bodies to enforce these immigration raids like DHS wants to. So it's not unlawful, if you just look at the plain text of the law in Title 10, for him to call up the National Guard. I know it's very rare for it to be done over the governor's objection. It hasn't happened for decades, since the South, the civil rights movement, and Selma, and even going back further to desegregation after Brown v. Board. But there is precedent for this, which is why I think Judge Breyer wants to hear from the Department of Justice, the federal government, to hear their position before he issues a ruling.
And it has been interesting because, like you said, it's a hot button issue. And even looking at some of this footage that we've had in our newsroom, I'm going to put this up as well, aerial footage of the response that we've seen from even local law enforcement. And Neama, I want to take the time because it is important to distinguish between the two, right? The National Guard or the Marines, those are under federal employment, but LAPD stepping in as they have to sort of get these protests under control, two separate issues.
Absolutely. So obviously, local police, LAPD, they're not going to be involved in the raids of, homes and businesses to deport individuals. But obviously, if they see violence against anyone, it can be a civilian, it can be a federal officer, they have to step in. That is a completely separate crime, and their job is to make sure that they're protecting the public, whether civilian or law enforcement. So that's what they're there for, to protect those officers, to protect buildings, to even protect the peaceful protesters. Because obviously, everyone has a right to protest under the First Amendment, but there's speech and there's conduct. So if you're launching fireworks, throwing Molotov cocktails, cinder blocks at, ICE agents or their vehicles, that is unlawful. And that's a crime under both state and federal law.
And so, Neama, it's not just happening in Southern California. We'll step away and get back to that conversation because we have this vantage point as well, as this is what's happening in New York City as well. Folks are also protesting against some of these immigration raids. Could we see similar action taking place by New York's governor if things get out of hand to the place where President Trump decides to call in the National Guard to New York City?
I wouldn't be surprised, Christina. Obviously, we know the president has taken aggressive action against these sanctuary cities. So, first was to stop federal funding, right? But now you're talking about actual active enforcement and operations. And if you're going to do that, you need the man and woman power to conduct these operations, especially if you're going to get resistance, because the political reality is many of these states like Los Angeles and New York are deep blue, and these laws are very unpopular. So they're going to be met with resistance. They're going to be met with protests. They may even be met with riots. So if you're law enforcement, you have to be prepared for these possibilities.
And so as we're looking ahead, if the judge decides to grant the temporary restraining order in this case in favor of Governor Gavin Newsom against the Trump administration, what immediately happens? Do those National Guard troops have to leave the area and only go back to those federal buildings that they were initially sent there for?
So one of two things will happen if that restraining order is granted. The question is, will the judge issue a stay? That means pause that order, because the judge will realize that obviously this is a very important issue of federal versus state rights. And that decision will go up on appeal. It will go to the Ninth Circuit, which is the appellate court that covers California. Historically, it's been pretty liberal, but with Trump appointees, it's become more moderate, and it'll be assigned to a 3-judge panel there. But really, this case is destined to make its way to the Supreme Court. And although Justice Breyer is no longer there, the Supreme Court justices, that 6-3 conservative majority, will have to decide this issue. That's what the High Court is there for, to wade into these important federal questions that we're dealing with. So I think even if the judge grants the restraining order, which probably shouldn't, but even if Judge Breyer does, I expect him to stay that order to allow a higher court to look into this and make the determination, because really you're dealing with the enforcement of federal law. And Christina, it's not a state issue. And this is why you can't have California have different immigration law than Texas or Arizona. It has to be uniform. And historically, it has been federal law, which is why I expect the Trump administration to win here. They don't win with the trial court. I think they will ultimately win on appeal.
All right. Again, legal analyst Neama Rahmani here to help us break down the very latest. I appreciate your time, as always, here on Live Now.
Thanks, Christina. Talk soon.